are listening to a free version of Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support the show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
The Majority Report with Sam Steeder.
It is Thursday, January 16th, 2020. My name is Sam Steeder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, how the other half learns. Equality, excellence in the battle over school choice. Robert Pondiscio. Also on the program today, Lev Parnas just threw Rudy and Trump and Pence and Barr and the whole crew under the bus. Maybe. Also on the program today, the Government Accountability Office issues a report, and just in time, ladies and gentlemen, White House broke the law by freezing Ukraine aid. It's going to have to change some of the talking points of some of the Republicans. Speaking of which, impeachment charges will be read today in the Senate by the House managers. In Virginia, the Virginia legislature has approved the ERA meeting the constitutional amendment threshold across the land. However, now Congress will probably have to extend the deadline. Don't count on that happening anytime soon. Meanwhile, also in Virginia, the governor declares a state of emergency to thwart armed militias. The Afghanistan Inspector General says the war and its reports from military and civilian leadership plagued with lies. A federal judge stops Trump's waivers to block refugees entering to the states. Sorry, Texas, you just got messed with. And Mark Pocan endorses Bernie Sanders. All this and more on today's program. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's show. It is a Thursday. As you know, Michael is out of town. And what will happen today is we're going to play this interview I did with Robert Pondiscio. He is a guy who works at the what institute was it? I can't remember now. The Fordham Institute. And the Fordham Institute is a pro-charter think tank. Pondiscio himself is also a pro-charter. He wrote an interesting book about after being embedded at Success Academy, which is the premier charter in New York and maybe the most famous one in the country. That's the one that they made that movie about. I think it was Waiting for Superman. And then there was other movies that basically showed how much propaganda Waiting for Superman was that followed in its wake. And this is a long interview. I recorded it the other day. His phone doesn't sound fantastic, but it sounds good enough. And I mean, I have to say, you know, and I think I addressed most of this to him. But what is fascinating about this interview to me, in addition to his I guess admission that charters aren't necessarily better. Well, let me rephrase this. There's a lot of things, a lot of questions as to why charters perform better sometimes. And there's also questions as to how we measure whether someone measures better. What are the metrics that we use to determine this? And we get into this. But what's fascinating to me is throughout this interview, I want you to listen carefully because we talk about this in other contexts. But I believe sincerely that Pondiscio does not believe he has an ideology about these things. I believe sincerely, I think he is sincere when he says, like, look, I'm just interested in how people learn. Well, he will say that and will not necessarily address broader policy questions, but will make broad sort of assertions or arguments of principle that necessarily have policy considerations. And I didn't want to get too bogged down with that, but I think if you listen to this, you will hear that. You will also hear what I think is the fundamental element of people who think they don't have an ideology and for whatever reason are just not examining certain questions. Much of his work is about coming to the realization that the way Success Academy succeeds is a function of not necessarily cherry-picking students, but cherry-picking parents. And at one point, we go back and forth, and I touch on this with him, but I want to make sure that you focus on this and catch other instances where he does this. He says, well, there are some parents who they don't want to get with that program. And the program he's talking about is you have to pick your kid up at 3 o'clock on Tuesdays, or one day a week, it's 12:45, and you have to be there at a certain time, and you have to come in for certain orientations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there is, in his mind, it is just whether the parents have the will to do this or not. It is not a question of do they have the resources, and that's not just money. It could be, I've got a good boss. Or I've got a boss who at least lets me go, without pay and pick up my kid at 12 o'clock. Or, we have some support at work for these things. Or my grandmother or my mother lives down the street. Or I have my best friend here and she, or he picks up my kids. I mean, all of these different things that not everybody has. In fact, most people don't have these things. And then we're talking about largely a population, at least in this instance of what he's discussing, are people who don't have the financial resources to make up for it. So it's very important to listen to this very carefully. And then keep in the back of your mind that Success Academy is an outlier in terms of performance with charters. And ultimately, it boils down to one question he has, one debate. And so I think you'll find it interesting. Later in the show, for the fun half, old Matt will be here. Matt Binder from Doomed will be here to do the fun half today. But before we get to any of that, you're all aware of the moment where Elizabeth Warren went over to talked to Bernie Sanders after the debate the other night, and Bernie Sanders put out his hand to shake her hand, and she did not accept that. She said something to him. He, responded with a hand gesture that I have to report is a Krav Maga gesture, which makes it look like you're not going to fight, but then you strike a blow. And it ended. And people wondered, what were they talking about? Besides, that hanger-on Tom Steyer, who was just sort of hanging around in the shadows. Like, hey, can I get an autograph? Well, it turns out that microphones were not cut. Or at least they were cut in terms of, imagine going out to broadcast. But they were still running, being recorded. And CNN has released that audio. It seems to me you should release all the audio then. I want to hear what the conversations the other people are.
Yeah, just put it online. Put the archive online. Open media.
Exactly. But the point is that there is a lot of value for a lot of different constituencies here to have Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders in a battle with each other. Here is the audio. We will run this now.
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
What?
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
Let's not do it right now. You want to have that discussion, we'll have that discussion. You called me. You told me. All right, let's not do it now.
I don't want to get in the middle of it. I just want to say hi, Bernie.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Love how. Yeah, good. I'm glad you didn't want to get in the middle of it. Bye. All right. Before I give any comments on this, I think it's very important that we look at this carefully. So we're going to slow this down to about half speed and watch this. Look at Tom Steyer. He's looking back and forth. Oh, this is uncomfortable.
Steyer looks more helpful in slow
I mean, look, folks, I can tell you, there's all sorts of conjecture. She knew that the microphone was on. She went over there to talk it, to get it recorded. I mean, if that's the case, then what you should do is come over there and go, Bernie, you're lying. And that's really upsetting. That's what you say if you've planned that out. Okay. I have been on the set. Every time I walk off the set of MSNBC, I am still wired. And it never occurs to me that somebody's recording it. But it's quite possible that they are. But I talk much freely, I can assure you, after I walk off the set. Whether it's to myself or to others. I don't think that they were aware the microphones were on. Maybe she was aware that she wanted to come across and address that. But look, here's the bottom line. No matter what you think the scenario is as to why this happened, and there are multiple ones, she couldn't control the leaks of those 4 people. She had told them contemporaneously. And then she weaponized it, or then she just didn't want to tell a lie, or then whatever. Or you could come up with the idea that it was the plan from the beginning. You can believe that Bernie said that, said something. We're not clear because she's never actually given a quote as to what was said. It was just that she expressed that she thought a woman could win. That's in the past tense. So she wasn't really expressing what she expressed in that moment. And he disagreed. So we don't even know what he disagreed with. But even if you take the position that Bernie Sanders never, despite all of his history and despite waiting for Warren in 2016, never, ever believes that a woman could ever win the presidency in the history or the future of America. And even if you believe that Elizabeth Warren weaponized this on purpose, the bottom line is, if you are supportive of Bernie Sanders, the best thing to do is what Bernie Sanders and his campaign is doing, which is to not take the bait. It is to not take the bait. Everybody now can see the performance of both of these people in this scenario. And the bottom line is that to the extent that you feel that this was a strategy by Elizabeth Warren. I happen to think it was, at least at one point. I'm not sure when they decided to weaponize it, but they had 8 hours to respond to those leaks. And she doesn't have to lie, but if she wanted it not to explode, she could have lied. Even if she was mistaken in what her belief was, or even if she was absolutely right, she could have lied. And that, in my estimation, would be not a very big deal in terms of anything. And he certainly wouldn't have come out like, no, I got to say, Elizabeth, your friends are right and you're wrong. I actually believe that a woman couldn't win. No, he never, if he believed that or said that, which I don't think that he did. I think there was a miscommunication. But even if he did, he never tried to weaponize it publicly like Joe Biden did a week ago. When he said Hillary Clinton lost because of sexism, I won't have that problem. That's what Joe Biden was doing. He was trying to weaponize that idea. If this was a strategy by Elizabeth Warren, I don't think it was a particularly good one. It was meant to show that she is willing to fight hard against anybody on behalf of her, the people. And I think it's to impress the Biden and Buttigieg voters. But these are all speculations. The bottom line is there is no scenario where this is part of the plan, where step 2 of the plan isn't to get Bernie Sanders supporters online to create the sense that they are bullying and blah, 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 whatever it is. And they're Bernie bros, and they're all ready to introduce that to thing. And so that's all I would say. If you want to help Bernie Sanders, do what how many more 25,000 new people did?
Yeah, reporting from Wall Street Journal, Eliza Collins says, speaking to supporters in a live stream, Sanders says, in the past 2 days, the campaign has raised roughly $4 million from 200,000 contributions, 25,000 of which were new donors.
Or go make phone calls like I'm doing this weekend. Or if you have the ability, go to Iowa, go to New Hampshire, volunteer. But you're not, at this point, everybody knows the deal, and nobody's being convinced of anything more than has already been convinced at this point. And so that audio, it really is better at 50% speed.
I'm all about positivity and party unity at this point, so I just want to commend Bernie on his situational awareness and not wanting to get into it on the stage there.
Yes.
So good job, Bernie. Positive.
That was a good idea. We'll put a pause on that. And, so, that's that. And I would also just encourage people to keep in mind issue sets. We're not voting for a prom queen or prom king or whatever it is. I'm going to take a quick break. When we come back, interview with Robert Pondiscio. He is a senior fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and a former inner city public school teacher. On his book, How the Other Half Learns, Equality, Excellence, and the Battle Over School Choice. We'll be right back after this. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Robert Pondiscio. He is the author. He is a senior fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and author of How the Other Half Learns, Equality, Excellence, and the Battle Over School Choice. Robert, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me.
So I got to say, I've done, and the past couple of years have been a little bit of a distraction of pursuing a lot of interviews with education writers, thinkers, educators themselves, of which you are all three. And for the most part, I have to say, that the overwhelming majority of those folks over the years have have come with a pedigree of charter skepticism. And so let's just, for the audience, because the Thomas Fordham Institute is associated with, pro-charter sentiments. I think you started your year of reporting on Success Academy as an embed, coming from that perspective, but you also spent almost half a dozen years as a public school teacher, or not all, that may have what led you to those. So just talk for a little bit about what your expectations were going into Success Academy, and just sort of, broadly what your perspective on education and particularly this question of education reform and charters, et cetera.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a fair question. And in fact, I think I spent the first chapter of the book kind of laying out my own educational journey and my perspective, just because I think as a writer and a reporter, I need to be, candid with readers. I was a mid-career switcher. I had a whole other life in the media business till about age 40 when I signed up for the New York City Teaching Fellows, a so-called alternative certification program here in New York City. And that led me to be a public school teacher at PS 277, which is then and now, I believe, so the lowest performing school in the lowest performing district in New York City, but obviously a traditional public zone neighborhood school. And yes, also true, I work for the Fordham Institute, and I'm a part-time charter school teacher now. So, I guess my ed reform credentials are in good order. I tend to be supportive of things like standards and assessments and charter schools. That said, what makes me, I think, somewhat different from folks who get involved in these kind of, like Nike versus Reebok, Burger King versus McDonald's fights over whose model is better, is the fact that that I am still a teacher. In other words, where the arguments about charters, both for and against, and ed reform for and against, tends to be about structures, things like charters, data, teacher quality, testing, etc. I tend to be the guy who says, hey, can we talk about what the kids do all day? In other words, the issue that I write most frequently about is what happens inside of classrooms, about curriculum, about instruction, pedagogy, classroom culture, etc. I would argue that transcends a lot of these arguments. That's one of the reasons that we, have charter schools, is for them to be laboratories of innovation, so to speak. Hopefully there's some lessons we can learn from those schools that we can apply to K-12 at large. So while sure, I'm unabashedly pro-charter, that does not mean that I'm one of those folks who says if everybody's a charter, or if every school was a charter, then every school would be good. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that.
Great. And so let me ask you just a couple of questions, and let me just start with that notion of charters as a laboratory for innovation, because I think, ultimately, or I should say initially, charters were roundly embraced. I think they may have come out of the teachers union movement or educators.
Yeah, I think that's right. Or at least that came out of the teachers union. I mean, they started in Minnesota almost 30 years ago. But I think what you're alluding to, and you're correct about, is Albert Shanker, the legendary head of the American Federation of Teachers, was an early charter proponent. So, there's not always been historically antagonism between teachers unions and charters, nor has there been historically what we have right now, where Republicans tend to favor them and Democrats have become fond of joking that there's two basic camps within the Democratic Party: those who hate charters and those who really hate charters.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's largely true. Although there were elements certainly of the Obama administration that seem to be significantly sympathetic.
That's my point. I mean, No Child Left Behind, less than 20 years ago, was bipartisan legislation. It was supported by both Bush and Teddy Kennedy. So there was broad bipartisan support for the whole ed reform portfolio, charter schools, testing, standards, etc. The fact that it is fractured so much along partisan lines is very recent innovation.
Right. And like I say, also the Obama administration as well. I mean, race at the top was largely influenced by that.
Well, that's exactly right.
Let's also just talk about this idea of education reform movement. It was largely, well, you tell me if I'm wrong about this, but one of the biggest forces that was pushing education, the education reform movement, as it was called, was the Gates Foundation, that invested close to $1 billion in some very limited, localized experimental stuff, but of course, supplemented that with other programs. And to a certain extent, I mean, from my perspective, dumping that kind of money and that kind of high-profile money seemed to dictate the terms of education reform, at least for an extended period of time. From your perspective, would you agree that assessment is accurate?
Well, I mean, you can't deny that the Gates Foundation and others, the Broad Foundation comes to mind, the Walton Family Foundation comes to mind. Ed reform has been a bit of a darling among deep-pocketed philanthropists for quite some time now. So, but I mean, look, I think that's all to the good. What do you want billionaires to invest their money in? I mean, building fountains or art museums or some such, or dance companies. I don't think there's anything wrong with people who have money. Going back to Andrew Carnegie, building libraries. I mean, this to me strikes me as a good use of philanthropic dollars. The question that you're hinting at, I guess, is the degree to which their influence has been a good or a bad thing. I mean, that's where, frankly, I reach the limits of my insight, because, again, I tend to focus more on classroom practice and whatnot, and issues and policy. While I'm not ignorant of them, they're not the main focus of what I do.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. I mean, but we should say, but let me just, well, first off, I mean, we know at least what the Gates Foundation's assessment of their own work was, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, you may know more about it than I do. I mean, they back when I first started getting involved in ed reform, one of their big issues was these small high schools where they would take, these massive high schools like the ones we had in New York City, break them up into small schools. Then they walked away from that effort thinking it had been unsuccessful. I don't want to get this wrong because this is not data that I'm really conversant in, but my understanding is those schools proved to be a little bit more successful than initially thought. So that speaks to a larger problem in education that transcends all of this, which is we tend to get whipsawed around by the shiny new thing and not stick to things that are tried and true.
Okay, I mean, I only ask because there was, back in I think it was in 2018. The Rand, the Gates Foundation hired the Rand Corporation to assess their work, and it was bad. I mean,
look,
kudos.
This is a serious problem in general, which is that and this is some of the issues I try to talk about in the book. Anybody who walks into any of this, regardless of your perspective, traditional schools, charter schools, pro-reform, anti-reform, thinking that they have the answer, well, this work will humble you very, very quickly.
Indeed, and I think that's one of the things I appreciate about your book is that it's very nuanced. But I think, I only bring this up in the context of so that people can have the basis, because I do want to talk specifically more about the book and what you found. But the Rand Corporation basically found that the plus $700 million, almost $800 million that the Gates Foundation dumped into their experiment was basically a waste, except for the fact that it showed that their perspective was wrong. And I think the Rand Foundation, more or less ended their report with, it's clear we should listen to educators, of which you are one of them. But I think just to get back to your point about, what we want people to do with philanthropy, it's one thing to build a library, but because that's fairly value neutral once you start to build that building, right? I mean, you could make an argument as the libraries should have ramps, or we should focus on this, but when you put $700-800 million and you are that high profile into a social experiment, and there is no, like you say, there's a problem with people walking into the schoolroom thinking they have all the answers. Well, this isn't just one person walking in. It's it's a foundation with a ton of money, a billionaire, and it will dramatically change the trajectory of school, of the ideology of teaching, as it did for, as far as I can tell, over a decade. And we're now, in some respects, unwinding from some of that, from my perspective.
Look, these are ideological points that I have some feelings about, but not strong feelings about. What I will say is, I want to be clear about this. I don't be critical of anybody, regardless of their perspective, who gets up in the morning and thinks about making things better for other people's children. And what I mean by that is these are deep, I don't want to say intractable problems. I'm not that depressive. Hopefully we can make some progress. But let's be clear that prior to the ed reform movement, it's not as if there was some golden age that we did.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah, so, I've written copiously about this, about the disappointments of the ed reform playbook, so to speak, but that's not the same thing as saying stop trying or just, trust the teachers and send more money, so to speak, because we've done that and that hasn't worked out either. Well, so hopefully there's room for men and women of goodwill, regardless of their perspective, whether they are traditional educators or philanthropists or charter folks or reformers or whatnot, to say, okay, look, we are doing a poor job educating boxcar numbers of American children, particularly low-income children of color. We got to do something more different, better than we've been doing.
And I would agree with that. I don't fault people for trying, but it occurs to me that perhaps maybe we need a more of a democratic process if we're going to wage such experiments with with public education. And I guess that, but
yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Anybody who says that they've got the answers is either ill-informed or about to be humbled, is what I would say.
Indeed, and that's why I think, I guess that's my point. Better to have 10 people in there who all think they have the answers, because then we will move more deliberately in some respects, rather than careening off based upon the person who's just got the most amount of money in the room. But with that said, let's talk about when you decided to embed yourself into Success Academy. Well, first off, tell us about Success Academy and why you decided to embed yourself in that one as opposed to any other charter school.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a New York City teacher and as somebody who spent his education career in and around New York, it's hard to ignore success. I mean, we've been just discussing for a few minutes all the difficult problems in moving the needle for low-income kids of color. Well, here's a network of charter schools that appears to have done so extraordinarily well. I mean, it's worth dwelling for a moment or two on just how well. As of right now, these are not numbers I have in front of me. They're ballpark figures from memory, so forgive me, Sam, if I don't have these exactly right. But as of this school year, there's something on the order of 17,000 kids in about 50 Success Academy charter schools, all of them here in New York City. So last year's standardized test, and again, I have a complicated relationship with testing, but it is how we keep score in education, so it's worth talking about. So among those 50 schools, then there were probably 35 or so with kids in testing grades, as we say. In other words, grades 3rd through 8th. So every year in every state in the country, kids sit annually for a state-issued math and reading test. Well, in the very lowest performing one of those schools, something like 90% of the kids were on grade level. In the very worst performing of those 30-some-odd schools, 85% of the kids were on or above grade level in reading, and mostly way above. So in other words, if this were a standalone school district, it would be by far the highest performing school district in the state of New York, including wealthy suburban districts like Scarsdale or Jericho or some such. And in case I'm not being clear on this, virtually the vast majority of their kids, over 90%, I believe, are low-income kids of color. So in other words, if the theory is, hey, under the right conditions, we can close the achievement gap, well, Success Academy appears not merely to have closed the achievement gap, but to have reversed it. In other words, they're outperforming school districts with predominantly affluent white and Asian kids. And so that makes them an object of fascination. Or sure, certainly ought to.
Indeed, and they've and there's been at least a couple of documentaries specifically about Success Academy, and we should say that 17,000 kids sounds like a lot of kids, I think, maybe to people living in other cities, but in New York City, the total number
1.1 billion. So
right. The total number of
New York City.
Right. Yeah. The total number of charter students is about 10%, I think, in New York City. And we should also say, just too, when we talk about this achievement gap, we are measuring it based upon these standardized tests. And that's I don't know. Is there? And I'm honestly not familiar. But in terms of how much recording is there of kids who've graduated from Success Academy, through the years, K through 12? Do we have much data on what kids are doing 5, 10, 15 years out?
No, we don't, because the very first, the tip of the spear, so to speak, would only be sophomores in college right now. Their first graduating class was just 2 years ago. So we're talking about, a few dozen kids, maybe.
All right, Robert, I'm sorry, we're just losing you just from an audio perspective.
Sorry, I'm not moving. I'm sitting stock still. So
okay. All right, there you go.
I'm not sure what happened. I was just saying that we don't have that data on Success Academy yet because they've only graduated their first couple of dozen high school students within the last year or two. It will be a decade or more before we can answer that question. But in the book, I spend some time, and I've done some reporting previously, on other charter schools. Most famously, there's a large charter network called KIPP, which stands for the Knowledge is Power program. They've got 200-odd schools, and they've been around for at least 20-some-odd years. So they have a couple of thousand kids who have already been to and through college. So we have data from them that indicates it's interesting because on the one hand, if you are a KIPP student, you are far more likely than the average low-income kid of color to attend college, like 3 or 4 times more likely. On the other hand, they're not graduating at the same numbers as, say, affluent white kids are, which I believe is something like 70, 75%. For KIPP, it's about between 35 and 40%. So it's great news. They're very successful in getting kids through and through college, but they still haven't quite cracked the code on matching the achievement levels or the attainment levels, like to be more precise, of white kids.
That's interesting. Has there been much research as to what that gulf is? And I guess really the comparison would be the apples to apples, I guess, would be kids coming from similar backgrounds and their performance in college, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And that's the holy grail of the entire education reform movement, which is to match the attainment. I'm using the word attainment versus achievement. When you talk about the achievement gap, you're talking about test scores. When you're talking about attainment, you're talking about the level of education reached. How far do you go, graduating high school, college, graduate school, et cetera. So when I say attainment, that means that these charter schools, as a class, urban charter schools are probably the one real bright spot for the ed reform movement. It's been a mixed bag otherwise. A lot of urban charters as a class are doing a good job with, again, college attainment, but they still haven't gotten it to the same level or same number, percentage as for the children of white Americans.
Okay. And so you spent a year at a specific school, a Success Academy, Bronx 1, up in, I guess in the Bronx.
Yep.
And this is you were in an elementary school, but it goes through 12, right?
Yeah, but again, it's since the kids all start in kindergarten and they don't what they call backfill. They don't admit students after 4th grade. There are far more Success Academy elementary schools than middle schools, far more middle schools than high schools. So it's kind of like a pyramid shape, and not every kid, this is one of the areas of controversy, is, a large number of kids just don't make it all the way through. They have very high attrition rates.
Okay, and so you follow, obviously you follow the principal, Elizabeth Vandelick, and I think you, if memory serves, you basically right up front that it's more than likely that I got permission to do this, because this is one of their prized. They had to feel comfortable with me embedding with a principal who they felt somewhat confident about. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's just common sense. But having said that, keep in mind that data I talked about before. In other words, at least on paper, looking at test scores, there's no such thing as a weak Success Academy school. They all produce positive results. But sure, it stands to reason that they wouldn't have let me embed in a school that they were less than confident that was worth, that was going to show them in a good light. That said, it was a struggle for this school that year. And I should also say one of the reasons that this school was chosen for me as a writer, it's literally across the street from where I was a student teacher in the Department of Education, and not far, a few blocks away from where I taught 5th grade for a few years. So I know the neighborhood, et cetera. In other words, they are successful in a neighborhood where I and many, many others have been less than successful.
What was, we'll get to that, but will you just also just give us a little background in terms of just for people who don't know. So the Success Academy was started by where Ava Moskowitz was the first educator brought in. It was started by 2 hedge fund guys, John Perry and Joel Greenblatt.
Yep.
And what was the genesis of this, and what was it just that these were guys who had money and they were like, we're going to help out here? They don't have these are nonprofits. Is that right?
Yeah, charter schools are nonprofits. They are tuition free. So there's a misimpression out there that these are private schools. That's not the case. You can't charge tuition when they're oversubscribed. You got to admit kids by lottery. But Petrie and Greenblatt And Greenblatt specifically, there was a terrific article going on 20 years ago. This is the first time it was on my radar screen, where, speaking of public schools, Greenblatt was interested in a program called Success for All, which was a whole school reform idea, and paid a boatload of dough to have it implemented in a New York City public school out by Kennedy Airport out in Ozone Park, and it was quite successful. Now, this was during the Bloomberg-Klein administration, so based on the success, Joel Klein himself told Greenblatt, hey, you need to do a charter school. In other words, you've got this formula that appears to work. Now maybe you should do this in a charter school, where you can put it on steroids, as they said. And that led, and then in comes Petrie, who was interested in starting a charter school. Greenblatt said, hey, I want to do Success for All. You want to do a charter school. We should do a charter school. Eva Moskowitz entered the picture some months later, after the charter was submitted, I believe, but before it was granted. They're not doing a pure Success for All charter school. That was the original conception, but that's the origin story, so to speak.
And where does a charter school get its funding for folks?
From the state, it's public dollars. Yeah. Sorry, I always assume people know these things, and you're right, Sam, that we should break this down for folks. Charter schools, if you're a charter school advocate, they are very adamant about calling them public charter schools. In other words, every kid in every state is entitled to a free and adequate public education on public dollars. So basically the way to think of it is that charter schools are public schools, but they are privately managed, but they are still paid for from your tax dollars. So, charter schools get reimbursed by the state for every child that they serve.
And we should say that
the amounts vary from state to state, but that's the basic idea.
We should say that's part of from a sort of just maybe a rhetorical, maybe from an ideological perspective. That's part of the one of the big questions. What constitutes
that's one of the criticisms for sure. That's one of the criticisms.
I don't mean to.
On
I
the
don't
other
want
hand, government services are privatized, as it were, all the time. There's government contractors doing all kinds of the public's business.
Indeed. The question is what makes it public? What makes a public school public? I mean, Betsy DeVos, was on record of saying she has no problem with public education. She does have a problem with public schools, which would mean that the public pays for the schooling of people, whether that was I'm going to fund, vouchers for people to go to a parochial school or to a private school or whatnot. And I just want to make this clear for people. I'm not trying to make a to make a point here, but there are various models too, wherein, for instance, to what extent the public has oversight of different charters, right? I mean, will you just walk us through the different models that exist in different states?
This is another criticism that because schools and it varies. Like here in New York City, the schools are under so-called mayoral control. We used to have a board of education. I don't know this, but I think it's probably far more common across America for schools to be under the control of a so-called school board, an elected school board. Charter schools, by and large, are under the control or under the management of just private boards. In the same way that you might be asked as an involved citizen to be on the board of a museum or whatnot, you get asked to be on the board of a charter school. They are. I think it's a little bit of an overstatement to suggest that they somehow have less rigorous oversight. I mean, anybody who has ever applied for a charter, and I've been part of processes where we apply for charters, to suggest that somehow it's a cakewalk to get authorized is a joke. I mean, it's damn rigorous. It's pretty damn hard to get a charter. And then once you're authorized, you are forever being called to account by your state authorizer. So I think it's this is my own personal opinion. I just think it's just incorrect to suggest that somehow charter schools are subject to less scrutiny. It's a question of the direct scrutiny. Is there an elected school board, or is there a government agency in your state capital that is inspecting what you do? But if anybody has the idea that you can have a charter school and just do whatever the heck you want. Well, that's simply not true. Now, having said that, can I say that there are not states and jurisdictions that are less hands-on than others? I haven't been to all 50 states, but at least here in New York, your oversight is pretty rigorous.
Right, and we should say there are states, obviously, where that's not the case at all. I mean, and there are states where you can have private charters, and I mean, so there is a
for-profit charters. That's right. Yeah, and in New York State, again, the state that I know best, there's no such thing as a for-profit charter. They're illegal by statute. So New York has a quality authorizer. We love them, even though they sometimes make your life difficult. I would argue, I would hold New York State up as a model as a state that does it the right way.
Okay, and so all right. So with that said, let's look. I mean, just into it was there. What you found over the course of the year. I mean, it's hard to sum up because this is a very sort of specific,
it's a complicated story.
Yeah, ethnography, and you follow. There's a couple of people that you follow. Obviously, Vandalik, who is the principal. Uh-huh. You wrap up, and then there's one kid in particular, Adama. Yeah. Tell us about Adama and why Adama is featured in your book.
One, if I can, if you'll indulge me, I mean, I'll just sum up the whole thing for you, which
Please.
Is, look, these are really, really good schools. Okay, let's just, there's been a lot of controversy around Success Academy. I spent a year at this one school. I visited many, many others, and without question in my mind, I think these are outstanding schools, and they are particularly serving well exactly the population we keep referring to. They are serving low-income kids of color astonishingly well. Having said that, there's a mythology that has grown up around charter schools because they are public schools, because they have lottery admissions, that suggests, okay, if this school can do it, then this shows that every school should do this. And that's where it gets complicated, Sam, because they don't necessarily serve every child well. Not every child is successful there. You alluded to the boy named Adama, who we can talk about, who flamed out. And the point that I made in the book that I think made a little bit of news is that not everybody gets in. In other words, it's easy to say, well, look, these are lottery admissions, so this proves that that this is a random assortment of kids and families, and this proves it can work for every kid. Well, in between the lottery in April and when school starts in August, Success Academy has any number of what I would describe as small but non-trivial hurdles that they make the family jump over. So first you've got to come to a welcome meeting, then you've got to confirm your interest in writing, then you go to a uniform fitting, et cetera, et cetera. And without question, at every step of the way, some number of families fall away because they're also preaching to the families, at every opportunity, look, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, this is what we will not stand for. They have a very particular culture, and not everybody wants that. The school uniform, the strict rules, the suspensions in kindergarten, on and on and on. Some family just says, "Oh, yeah, no, that's not for me." So the upshot of this is this winnowing process results in a families who are buying what Eva Moskowitz is selling, to put it clearly, or at least willing to go along with it. Now, that's not
to be fair,
story, but that sets the conditions that let them succeed.
Okay, so I mean, let me, and I should add, I mean, it's not just a question of they decide to buy or not. I mean, on some level, it's they can afford to, right? I mean, it's not just a question of dollars. I mean, of course, well,
it's not a question of dollars at all, since the schools are free. But there are complicated questions of parental bandwidth, for example. They make prodigious demands on parents, and if you're not a parent who can be deeply engaged and bring your kid to school at 7:45 and pick her up at 3:45 and half days on Wednesdays with that professional development, etc. If you don't have the time to read to the kid every night and do the homework logs, etc., then this is probably not your child's not going to be successful there.
Right, and to a certain extent, there are. I mean, what you're describing, as hurdles, is also on some level is filters, and this has been one of the criticisms of making an assessment of these schools in terms of like how pedagogically effective they are, is that they are Well, the general argument has been that they are self-selecting students, or that students self-select, or that the charters are setting up a process in which they are, in ways, creating obstacles or filters for specific students. You argue that
I think it's a little more complicated than that, Sam,
right.
if I may.
Please.
In other words, the traditional argument has been, Success Academy and other charters are, quote, and I'm making air quotes, creaming kids, meaning that they are, they're attracting only the easiest to teach, compliant kids, et cetera. And that's how they are getting these results, because they're cherry-picking kids. What I'm describing in my book is, well, no, what they're actually doing is they're cherry-picking parents, but even that's not correct. They're creating a mechanism for parents to cherry-pick themselves, so to speak. I mean, and I'm not Eva Moskowitz or Success Academy's cheerleader, but, one undeniable fact here is they're setting up this mechanism for low-income families of color to choose their way into a school, and with that, they are getting scores that are better than the gifted and talented programs in New York City, where the city actually does the picking itself. So if you want to say that, it's just this cherry picking, well, then you need to explain how they're getting numbers with families who are lining up for it that are better than what the city is getting when they cherry pick.
Right. And just so that people don't, in New York City, you can take your kids when they are in pre-K, in kindergarten, first, I think up to second grade. You can have them take a test, a standardized test, and if they place, depending on how well, depending on what the curve is, they become eligible for what are known as gifted and talented programs that exist within existing public schools in some instances, or are actually K through 12 schools that are exclusively.
I think it's a mix. Yeah, I think there's some standalone schools like Hunter. There's some gifted and talented programs like the Anderson and Nest and whatnot. Yeah, New York City people fetishize these schools to an unholy degree. That's right.
Yes, and there are some that are actually exist within existing public schools.
That's right.
And they're increasingly falling out of favor. It appears, just from, I mean, I don't know the data on this, but just from it's a sense I have. Let's put it that way.
I think on the left, they've fallen out of favor on the left. I think on the right, they're still very much not out of favor.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
If I may broadly oversimplify.
But let me just this notion of cherry picking. There is a mechanism in which you pick cherries, which would be, I'm going to look around at the cherry tree, just to let's beat this metaphor into the ground. I'm going to go around and I'm going to hand select each cherry, and I'm going to pull that off the thing, and that would be the equivalent of I think on some level what we're seeing with gifted and talented in terms of students, right? You take a test. If you're in the 99th percentile. Now, of course, not all those parents then pursue getting into schools. I can tell you that, like, if your kid can get a 99 on that test, you can go down to Nest, which is K through 12, which is highly sought after, because the idea that you don't have to move your kid from elementary school to middle school to high school, you could sit in an auditorium with 700 people and still highly, highly competitive. And I sat through one of those meetings, frankly, and waited about 45 minutes until they said there are 2 slots for second graders, and they're both taken up by kids who are siblings of other kids here, because we try and keep those together. And then I left after about a 4-hour effort there. But
you know what this says to me, Sam, and this gets to the soul of why I wrote this book. It's real easy and unsatisfying, honestly, to view this as a kind of either a political or technocratic lens. The scene that you're just describing of parents just desperate to get a good outcome for their kids is what we should really be focusing on, I would argue. So on the one hand, my look at Success Academy is I think laudatory. Again, I just said I think these are terrific schools, but I'm clear-eyed about this. This is not the answer for every kid. But to those who want to say, well, look, if you can't do this for every kid and you shouldn't do it for any kid, well, then you run into a real moral dilemma. Because let's be brutally honest here. If you are in this country, white and affluent, you already have ready access to great schools. You can pay tuition to go to private school. You can pick up and move to the burbs where your property tax might as well be your private school tuition. And none of that is controversial. Like, nobody says to a well-off white person, hey, you're robbing the public school system of the resource that is your child. Now, if this happens, if an Eva Moskowitz comes along and figures out a way to give a low-income family of color something like that, well, now suddenly it's a problem and it's a controversy. So that's the dilemma that I just, I don't understand.
All right. Now,
why is it okay for one group of Americans to have access to excellence, but another, well, you get equity.
Right, and actually, I was that's jumping ahead a little bit. I promise you, I have that page 332 open right in front of me, where you make that very argument, and I think that is. But let me just just back up a little bit to get to that point, because there's a couple of assumptions I think that are embedded in that the scenario that you're drawing there that I think are really the ones that need to be examined, because when we talk about the cherry picking. Again, I can go around and I can pick specific cherries off a tree, or I can develop a mechanism in which I shake the tree and I have a sieve at the bottom, and only certain cherries get through. And to a certain extent, I think that's what you're describing in terms of the cultural cachet, if you will, or the what do they call it? The non-financial sort of capital, I guess, that these parents have. They either, maybe it's just coming from within them and they're like, I'm going to make this work, or maybe they have more family support, and so they can pick up the kids at at 12:45 on a Wednesday as opposed to 3:45, or they can do it at 3:45, or they have mechanisms to take care of the kids at 3:45, or whatever it is. They have the ability to take time off, like I did, to go down, because I have the ability to go down to that Nest meeting, and I know a lot of parents didn't. They didn't have the time for it. Now, part of it is they're not as motivated. And then I think you raised the question of why, when we do have these opportunities for wealthy people, and I would contend that there's actually a growing awareness how problematic it is, that certainly I've spoken to people about it, about what's embedded in those choices when a wealthy person either heads to the suburbs or moves to a wealthier part of the city and has access to these schools and the better public schools or the private schools, whatnot. And then the question, as you put it, is, well, I mean, I don't need to repeat it too much, but it's like if Moskowitz has created something like the poor man's private school, means for engaged and ambitious low-income families to surround themselves with like-minded souls, raising their children in a cocoon of high expectations and academic achievement in places where it has seldom existed, many will likely applaud the effort and share her view that it is, in fact, serving the cause of equity and working for a common good. It would be dishonest to pretend that success is not a self-selection engine, but it's equally dishonest to close to cruel to deny such families the ability to self-select in the name of equity. And I think that's ultimately the point you're trying to make. And I think that's right. I would agree that dynamic in and of itself is not political, but it's political choices that lead us to that point, A, and B, that does not necessarily mean, why, if we as a society want to come to the solution of we want to allow people who have the ability to engage in the way that these parents have the ability to engage in getting their kids educated, why couldn't, let me ask you this, why couldn't we do that with public schools? Let's just put it for a second. We're going to take it out of politics. From a sheer mechanical standpoint, why couldn't we do that with public schools?
Well, there's this assumption, I think, and tell me if I'm misunderstanding you, that if we just got the curriculum right, the instruction right, the resources right, the funding right, then every school would be perfect for every child.
No. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying,
okay.
why is it that, because obviously Success Academy is the most successful charter school in New York, and to the point where people are making movies about it. That model is hard to replicate even by other charters, right? Otherwise we would see it a lot. But it's not. It's really just a function of like a specific set of criteria, which is, building that filtering mechanism to get those.
I think I see where you're going, and this is where I guess Eva Moskowitz, I think, is under the impression that her schools would be completely scalable, and I'm a little bit skeptical of that, even though I like the schools that she's made. And the reason that I don't think it's scalable is because of the school culture. In other words, if you wanted to say tomorrow, okay, look, we're going to turn every school into a Success Academy, you're going to have uniforms and kids are going to sit up and be forced to track the speaker and march in 2 straight lines and get demerits and get suspensions and whatnot, a lot of parents would say, no, I don't want that. That's not the kind of school I want my kid to go to. And they're not wrong about that. So in other words, you have to have, in my estimation, a public education system that allows that allows parents. This is why I'm a choice guy, Sam, and you're probably not. That allows parents to find a school culture that is a good fit for them. In other words, look, I love test scores as much as the next guy. Okay, maybe not as much as the next guy, but I'm not. I like test scores. It's fine. I'm not the guy who says, "Tell me the test scores," and that tells me everything I need to know about the school.
So let me ask you this then. So is the value of your work limited to saying that Success is a good school and there's really nothing that we can extrapolate from it, and it should exist?
No, there are things we can extrapolate from it, but just see, this gets back to where this conversation started up top, which is if you look at charters as laboratory of innovations, then that's exactly the right question. Okay, what are the lessons we could learn here? Now, cheerleaders for success will say, okay, this is what it should be. Every school should be this way, and I'm saying, no, not quite. But that does not mean there's no lessons. And this is going to get somewhat technical, but if you'll indulge me, one of the things that I think is and should be taken from Success Academy to every school is their curriculum. Now, let me be clear. I don't necessarily love their curriculum, but having been a teacher for so long, teachers spend a god-awful amount of time, people don't realize this, developing lesson plans on their own. And I make jokes about this. This is like if you're a doctor, it would be insane to say you should homebrew your own pharmaceuticals. If you're a contractor, you start the day in the lumber yard. You don't start the day in the forest with a chainsaw. But we tell teachers all the time, oh, you're the best person to know what every child needs. So, and we got data on this. Teachers spending 10, 20, 30 hours a week on websites like Teachers Pay Teachers and Pinterest and Google looking for materials and lesson plans. Well, they don't do any of that at Success Academy. They've got a curriculum, so the full-time job of the teacher is to get really good at delivering that curriculum. That makes all the sense in the world to me, and this is why they're able to take fairly young teachers, fairly inexperienced teachers, and get really, really good results because they've made the job doable for those people. So I don't want you to have the impression that there's no lessons. I just don't know that you can impose the Success Academy culture on those who don't want it.
Right. Well, if it's conceivable that the curriculum that they develop there would be the best curriculum, but if you don't have the culture, maybe that curriculum doesn't actually produce the results that you're talking about. I guess what I'm asking is that there's a dismissal of political questions and sort of the broader relevance of this. I don't really know anybody who has a specific issue with the existence of charters as much as.
Oh my goodness! Do you want to meet them?
Well, but wait a second. Let me finish. The problem is that it's seen that it is a distraction from, because you're saying we should provide this option. Now, of course, there are, the argument that you're making is in the negative. That, in other words, that the argument that we shouldn't have charters is tantamount to saying that we shouldn't give people who are disadvantaged in terms of finances and in terms of just resources more broadly an opportunity, and that's not fair. And I would agree with that. But of course, there's a whole nother set of people who are neighbors of let's say, I mean, you write about him. King James, the kid whose parents blew it. And he had gotten into the school, and the parents they blew it. They didn't show up on time. We don't, I don't know what happened necessarily, but I mean, those kids are also
sure.
Now, it would be unfair to me to say, like, well, to assess, that if you support Success Academy, then you're basically saying it's perfectly fair that King James doesn't get an opportunity at it. And of course, that's not the case.
Not quite. And this is actually where I think I've gotten crosswise with some of my ed reform colleagues. Because, the story that we tell in ed reform all the time is, hey, look, when you've got a critical mass of charter schools in a city, well, that creates a rising tide that lifts all boats, so everybody wins. And I think that's naive and probably incorrect. I mean, I spent some time in the book talking about some of my former students at PS 277, and there were no charter schools back then, but there were no Success Academies, I guess I should say, back then. But if there were, I can think of some students that I had then who would be the Success Academy kids from Central Casting. Their families would have them out of our school and into Success, in a nanosecond. And if I'm supposed to believe that would not have a negative effect on my school, well, I just don't believe that. And if the research suggests that, well, then I think we're just asking the wrong questions. But let me be really crystal clear about this. That's not the same thing as saying you therefore don't have a right to take your kid out and get them into a better setting for your kid. I think we have to be clear-eyed in both directions. We have no right to say to low-income kids of color, or only to them, Sam, no, I'm sorry, your child is a public resource. We need to keep you in this school because your kids make this school better. Because nobody says that to me. Nobody. But let me finish the thought, if I may. By the same token, I think we need to be clear-eyed that when you take engaged families out of kids, it's going to have a downstream effect, but that just means they're different settings, and they need different things and different resources and different styles of teaching, and we just need to be clear-eyed about that.
Well, I mean, it's not like there aren't other options, though, right? I mean, we could, as a society, decide that we're going to finance education in a different way so that we don't get these kind of disparities. We could,
sure.
Well, I mean, I guess the point being is that, like, you're not done, right, in your work as a fellow. Like, the idea that you found a school that is successful and has been able to achieve a culture that is successful for its kids, at least as measured by test scores, in the way that we talk about the achievement gap, as measured by test scores. But you don't think that culture is necessarily scalable, or you could duplicate it, because we've seen plenty of evidence that doesn't happen. Particularly like this. You happen to go to the Michael Jordan of education. Entrepreneurs, as it were. I mean, you're not done, right? I mean, like, what's the next step? If the answer is, like, for some of the kids, of students, some, not all low-income kids. In fact, the vast majority of, low-income kids still, because their parents, whatever, won't have that opportunity. And there's only so much Success Academy to go around. And we can't build an entire, what happens when even Moskowitz passes away?
Well, I think what it implies to me is and it's interesting. I think I wrote this in the book. I walked in expecting to write a book about curriculum and instruction, because that's what I usually write about, Sam. I mean, I made this clear. I tend to write about what kids do all day. The thing that was surprising to me was that I ended up writing a book about school culture. and what happens when, because this to me, at the risk of over-summarizing, the real magic of what happens at Success Academy is that every adult in a kid's life is pulling in the same direction, singing from the same hymnal, choose whatever metaphor you like, including the parents. So you've got administrators, teachers, office supply or support people, parents, etc., all presenting the same ideas to kids about academics, about excellence, about effort, etc. So the kids end up almost growing up in this high expectations environment, and that's super powerful. Now, here's the thing. That's difficult to scale and to impose. So the challenge, and again, this, I think, transcends the usual battle lines over traditional education or, ed reform and charter schools. We used to judging schools by their test scores, for example. We don't really have a vocabulary even around judging schools by their culture. And culture is a difficult thing, right? In other words, and we talked about it before, what I might want, it's interesting to compare this to what, rich parents in Manhattan do. So, a few miles from where I'm sitting are some of the most expensive private schools in America, places like Brearley and Dalton and Collegiate that charge $50,000 a year or more. Well, rich parents can parse the differences between those schools like Talmudic scholars. I mean, and it's if they're like different species, when to my mind, they're very fine-grained distinctions. So these are, some of the wealthiest people in this city. They're not using test scores when they decide where to send their kids. They're looking at school culture. They're looking at facilities. Looking at everything but test scores because the test scores don't even exist. That's not the way we evaluate schools for low-income kids of color. So I don't have an answer for this, but I think it's worth thinking about. What would it look like if we enabled poor parents to make some of the same decisions about where to send their schools that rich parents do, again, uncontroversially?
All right, so let's wrap up with this question because I'm curious. I mean, because obviously you've spent a year, in a charter school. You've been writing about, how schools approach their students now, both from like a sort of a curriculum based and in terms of culture. What's the answer broadly, or do you have any ideas in terms of like what we should be doing with public education? I mean, if this is just a, I think like, and maybe I'm wrong, but it appears that you're saying like this is this cauterizes a small part of a wound, and we should allow for that cauterization of that small part of a wound. And maybe I'm not characterizing it correctly, but it seems like that. Like you're saying, like this is an effective, a Band-Aid for one part of the problem, and it's a narrow one that's not necessarily scalable, but we should allow it to exist because it does less harm than it does better. I mean, it does more than less harm. It does good for a specific number of people. But what is the answer for the, we have another million people who are in public education in New York City.
I think I'm better at asking questions than answering them, frankly. And I think a lot of this book is born of the frustration with the answers that we're pursuing. I guess the best way to frame this, and I alluded to this before, if you are well off in this country, you have something approaching school choice, and the ability to pursue an excellent education, and if you're poor, you don't. Now, what's interesting. There's kind of we're in a profound anti-privilege moment right now. I mean, think of the Varsity Blues scandal where Felicity Huffman went to jail, et cetera. So there's this idea loose in the land, I think, and you'll tell me if you disagree, that, we are going to shame privilege. And privilege doesn't care, to be blunt about it. You can't shame privilege. If you every attempt that you make, I would argue, at least I can't think of a counterexample, to make schooling fairer does not affect the privileged. I mean, that's what privilege is, right? Privilege means I have the resources and I know how to work the system to get the best outcome for my kid. So if you have one class of Americans, the privileged who are free to pursue their privilege and get the best possible education, well, then you're basically disadvantaging the already disadvantaged because they don't have those abilities. They don't have those privileges. So the privilege will say, hey, thanks very much for less competition, and now I'm fatally disadvantaging, the disadvantaged by not giving them the opportunity to even pursue excellence. So I don't have the formula for you to guarantee an excellent education for every low-income kid of color. But what troubles me is when we look at things like Success Academy, like other charter schools, and say, oh, no, that's not fair. We must give the same thing to every child because it's fair. Well, again, the privileged aren't concerned about fair. The privileged are concerned with doing the best they can or getting the best they can for their child, and they're going to get it because, again, that's what privilege is. So I wrestle with that dichotomy that says that we're going to turn a blind eye to privilege and in an attempt to make things fair, and making air quotes around the word fair, for low-income people, we deny them the ability to even attempt to catch up with the privileged.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's wrong to sort of perceive it as a sort of like a fairness in terms of that people go to Success Academy are privileged over others. I think it's one of the things that in my experience in talking to educators over the years has been every single one of them almost has said. And I think you probably would agree that for the most part, you tell me the area code a kid lives in or zip code, and I can tell you the educational outcomes that are there.
Yeah, well, it's not axiomatically true, but it's certainly the way back.
And I think maybe the answer lies in maybe broader societal questions as to what we should do with those who, with more resources than others. And I think that, that is also a major topic in society today. But, Robert, thank you for granting me so much time to talk about this. The book
I enjoyed it.
How the Other Half Learns: Equality, Excellence, and the Battle Over School Choice. Robert Pondiscio. We will put a link at majority.fm to the book. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for having me.
There we go. Look at that. For people who are just tuning in, I might be surprising you because I am indeed not Sam Seder. What's up, everybody? It's Matt Binder.
Hello, Matt.
The old... do you guys still call me Old Matt on this show?
Yeah.
Old Matt.
Matt Binder of Doomed.
Yeah, Matt Binder of Doomed, right. I do have my own show called Doomed with Matt Binder. It's been a while since I've been on. Not since I've been on, but since I've worked here now.
It has been. Do you remember your last week here when you worked here? Because that was my first week, and it was Sam in Vegas week.
I remember that vaguely. I do remember doing the last Matt and Mike Monday.
Yep.
And
I was behind the board for that.
Yes, and that was like your first real test.
Yep.
Aw, getting some MR lore from before my time.
Right, yeah. It's still hard to believe that 2015 was the last time I actually was an employee of the Majority Report.
Doesn't seem like all that long ago, despite it being close to 5 years.
Yeah, the world hasn't changed all that much.
No,
nothing really has happened since then.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah. Obama's still president, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, this was the first half of the show, which I did not do, but I will be taking over and doing the second half of the show, and we will be going to that second half in just a second. But first, the fine folks who work with Sam here have their own shows to plug.
Oh, yeah. This week on the Antifada, I speak with Leslie Lee III from Struggle Session about South Korean filmmaker Bong Joon-ho's beautiful, subversive, and very anti-capitalist masterpiece, Parasite. And it's a very good film. I encourage everybody to see it before you listen to my show, because this is one movie that I think spoilers actually do matter for. The less you know going in, the better. And yeah, check it out. Patreon.com/theantifada. Also, we have a new episode of History is a Weapon coming out next week. I know you guys, all you history nerds out there, like to hear Sean KB and Matt Chrisman from Chapo Trap House talk about history, so get stoked for that.
Wow, what a professional over here. What a plug. What a
Why,
plug.
thank you.
Go ahead, Matt.
Literary Hangover, a 1708 poem that proves that irony existed in the 18th century because it's ostensibly a English sort of entrepreneur that comes over and looks down upon the American colonists as sort of like rabble that don't really have class distinctions and have terrible food and things like that. But then you realize actually the poem might be making fun of the Englishmen. It's an interesting view of the early colonial legal system and how it was easily bribed and bought, and about we talk about how the proletariat of the American colonists was sort of developed by English privatization of the commons. So check that out.
Fascinating.
Sounds up my alley.
And do you have anything to plug, buddy?
No, buddy. I got nothing to plug.
Come on, you don't got any dates?
No, nothing.
All right, well, you can check out my show at doomedpod.com. Also subscribe to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/MattBinder. And I don't have any specific episodes to plug because unlike you guys, I don't plan that far in advance. So my shows just sort of happen when they happen. Other than that, I guess we'll be going to the second half of the show now, where I, old Matt Binder, will be your guide. I will be hosting and taking care of everything until the end of the show. So let's do it.
Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous? You're a little bit upset? You're riled up?
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude, you want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
That's a good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 2, 38, 56, 27. 1/2, 5 eighths, 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy!
Dance, dance, dance. I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agreed.
No.
Death to America.
You.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook. Throw our hands up.
Ooh. Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey! Shut up!
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.